All right, good morning, fifth grade. We're going to go ahead and look at our timeline first before we start reading Chapter 6, Lesson 2. So we have February of 1787, the Confederation Congress calls for the rewriting of the Articles of Confederation. Then in May of 1787, we have the Constitutional Convention begins. In July of 1787, we have the Great Compromise is made. In December of 1787, Delaware is the first state to ratify or approve the Constitution. June of 1787, we have New Hampshire ratifies the Constitution, making it the law of the land. And then in May of 1790, we have Rhode Island becomes the last of the original 13 colonies to ratify the Constitution. So the first one was ratified in December of 1787, and then the last state to ratify was in May of 1790. All right, let's go ahead and move ourselves back over here. Let me just fix this really quick. I apologize. All right, so continuing, we have how does the Constitution set up our government framework? So we're on Chapter 6, Lesson 2. So we're on the Constitutional Convention. Shays' Rebellion showed that there was much dissatisfaction with the Articles of Confederation. On February 21st of 1787, the Confederation Congress decided to gather delegates to discuss changing the Articles. This convention of delegates would take place at the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia. Invitations were sent to the states. All but Rhode Island sent delegates to the Constitutional Convention. Members of the Continental Congress were not the only delegates at the convention. The delegates also included Revolutionary War veterans, governors, lawyers, plantation owners, merchants, and other influential people. In total, 55 men took part in the convention, which began on May 25th of 1787. They met in secret so that the delegates could speak freely and suggest ideas that might have hurt their reputations if the ideas became known. The doors were locked and the windows covered. Although the convention's purpose was to fix the Articles of Confederation, the delegates soon began to write a new constitution for a new government. Okay, we have conflicts and compromises. George Washington was elected to lead the convention, but James Madison of Virginia did most of the work on the actual writing of the Constitution. Madison was largely responsible for convincing the other delegates to abandon the idea of fixing the Articles of Confederation. Madison wanted to start over and create a stronger national government. On May 29th of 1787, Virginia Governor Edmund Randolph proposed a plan of government designed by Madison called the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan called for a two-part legislature to make the laws. The members of the first part, or the lower house, were to be elected by voters. The members of the second part, or the upper house, were to be chosen by the members of the lower house. The lower house would also select a president as well as judges for a national court. In the Virginia Plan, Congress had the ability to veto state laws and even take over a state's government. The number of legislatures in the House would be calculated based on the number of people in each state. All right, so here we have James Madison, who championed or kind of came up with the Virginia Plan. Some delegates had problems with the Virginia Plan. Under it, Congress would consist mainly of delegates from the states with the most people. These states would have more say in making laws and choosing officials. They could even take control of the governments of the smaller states. The New Jersey delegate, William Paterson, offered an alternative. His New Jersey plan also had a legislator to write laws. Its legislator would have only one house, and each state would have only one delegate. This way, every state would have an equal say. And so here's William Paterson, who created the New Jersey plan. So this plan was opposed by the larger states. They asked why a small state should have the same power as a large state. If the government of a nation was not controlled by the majority of its people, then how could the government be a democracy? Furthermore, these delegates saw the plan as being too similar to the Articles of Confederation. The New Jersey plan did answer some of the problems of the Articles, however. The national government would have some control over trade and would be able to raise money through import and stamp duties. There would also be an executive position created to control the military. Nonetheless, these measures weren't enough to convince the other delegates. They believed that the New Jersey plan would fail, just as the Articles of Confederation had. So, who was right? Both sides had fair points. Democracy means that laws should be agreed upon by the majority of the people, not by a small group of rulers. But states with small populations shouldn't be powerless against larger states. The argument continued for a month before Connecticut delegate Roger Sherman proposed the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise combined the two plans. It called for a legislature with two houses. In one house, the House of Representatives, the population of a state would determine how many delegates the state would get. Here, the larger states had more power. In the other house, the Senate, each state would have two delegates. This would give the smaller states protection from the larger states. In order for a law to be approved, it would have to pass through both the House of Representatives and the Senate. In other words, a law would have to be supported by both a majority of the people and a majority of the states. The Great Compromise was adopted on July 16th of 1787. All right, so I know that some of you have already seen this infographic, but I wanted to kind of point it out again. So we had the three plans. We have the New Jersey plan that benefited the small states, the Virginia plan that benefited the larger states, and then we have the Great Compromise, which is kind of, again, a compromise is pieces of each that we could agree upon. So quickly to go over this again, the New Jersey plan appealed to smaller states, had one part legislator, and each state would get one representative in the legislature. Then we have the Virginia plan that appealed to the larger states, had a two-part legislator, a lower house to be elected by the voters, and then an upper house would be elected by the lower house. And then the number of representatives in the houses would be based on the number of people in each state. So then we got the Great Compromise from these two plans that has a two-part legislator. The number of delegates in the House of Representatives would be determined by the population of each state. And then the Senate would have two delegates from each state. And then a law would not be approved until it passed through both the House of Representatives and the Senate. So in addition to the Great Compromise, there was a 3/5 compromise. Many of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention owned plantations with enslaved people. Should these people be counted as part of the population? Counting them would give states with slavery more representatives. However, enslaved people were denied by law any political power of their own, so those extra votes would go to the slaveholders. Without those extra votes, there was a good chance that Congress would outlaw slavery. The Southern states refused to join the new government unless they could be sure that Congress couldn't end slavery. Thus, the delegates decided that enslaved people would be counted, but for less than free persons. So for every 5 enslaved people counted, 3 people would be added to the population count when determining representatives. The Southern states also agreed to stop future trading with other countries for enslaved people in 1808. However, people already enslaved and their children were to remain enslaved. So, the 3/5 compromise said that for every 5 slaves, you could count it as 3 people. So, how fair is that, saying that 5 slaves are only worth 3 people? Obviously, we all know that slavery was this horrible thing, but that was something that happened in our country, and we have to talk about it. So it's there. And those southern states, those plantation owners that owned slaves, were fighting to get the slaves counted so they had more representation in Congress. So another thing that added to the Constitution, it said that the Southern states also agreed to stop future trading with other countries for enslaved people. So they could no longer buy and sell slaves from other countries. But those slaves that were already enslaved, already in captivity, could still be slaves, but you couldn't purchase any other ones from outside the country. You could still purchase and sell within the country, but not from outside the country. All right, so I'll go ahead and start off with this picture that's pictured up here. This was the Pennsylvania State House, now known as Independence Hall, where the U.S. Constitution was signed on September 17th of 1787. So we have the new government. After nearly 4 months of work, the delegates of the Constitutional Convention completed and signed the new U.S. Constitution. The document begins with a one-sentence preamble or introduction that explains the purpose of the Constitution. The preamble reflects the primary belief of the founders of this country. A government is meant to serve its people. The government has to be effective enough to help people, but organized in a way to prevent it from oppressing them. The delegates believed that a national government should have only as much power as the people allow it to have. To prevent the government from becoming too strong, the Constitution created a federal system in which the powers of government are divided. There is division of powers between state and national government, and there is also division of powers among the 3 branches of the national government. The 13 colonies rebelled against Great Britain because the British government had too much power, and the colonies had too little. The Articles of Confederation failed because the states had too much power and the national government had too little. This time, the framers of the Constitution wanted to get the balance of power just right. So let's talk about some of those powers and how they're divided here. So it says both the state and national governments can make laws and collect taxes. State governments, however, determine matters such as marriage age, driving age, and much of what is taught in public schools. State and local governments are also in charge of services like most police and fire protection, public libraries, and public transportation. What people need or want from a government can vary from person to person, city to city, and state to state. The founders thought it best to have many everyday duties handled by state and local governments. The average person can access these government bodies more easily. They also can shift more easily to suit the unique needs of their area. Meanwhile, the national government is divided into 3 branches: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Each branch has its own set of powers and duties, and no branch can do the job of another. Not only that, each branch has powers and weaknesses compared with the other branches. This system of checks and balances ensures that no individual or group becomes too powerful. So we'll talk a little bit more about the executive, legislative, and judicial branches in a minute here. Let's go ahead and look at those pictures on here. It says a U.S. postal worker is a federal employee. Law enforcement officers can be state, local, or federal. And that a public school is run by the state and local governments. All right, so let's go ahead and read about these 3 different branches of the federal government. So starting off with the legislative branch. The legislative branch is in charge of making laws. It consists of Congress, which has 2 houses. The House of Representatives. Each state has a number of representatives that is based on how many people live in the state. The representatives serve for 2-year terms. The representatives serve for 2-year terms, and then they have to be reelected if they want to stay. The other house is the Senate. It has 2 senators for every state. Senators serve 6-year terms, and they can also be reelected. The members of Congress write bills, and a bill must be approved by both houses to be passed. The bills passed by Congress must be approved by the executive branch to become laws. If a bill is not approved by the executive branch, it can still become a law if a large majority of Congress approves it. Laws can be ruled unconstitutional by the judicial branch. So that's how the legislative branch is checked. That the executive branch, meaning the president, he could veto a bill, but if it goes back to Congress and they have a majority vote or a large majority vote, they can overturn it. Or the judicial branch can check the legislative branch by saying, no, that law can't be passed because it's unconstitutional. So then we have the executive branch. That's where the president's at. The executive branch carries out the law. The highest position is the President of the United States. But the executive branch also includes the Vice President and the Cabinet, which is composed of the leaders of the various government departments. These departments include the Department of State, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Justice. The department heads are chosen by the president, but must be approved by the Senate. Through these departments, the executive branch enforces the law. The president also commands the military and has the ability to sign treaties. The president also chooses justices for the Supreme Court. If the president fails to do the job properly, the legislative branch can impeach him or her. The judicial branch can rule presidential actions as unconstitutional. Okay, so again, we have the checks and balances. So the executive branch. So the legislative branch can check the president or check the executive branch by saying that if the president fails to do the job properly, they can impeach him or her. And then the judicial branch can say, hey, what the president is doing is unconstitutional. So that's the way they can check and balance each other there. And then lastly, we have the judicial branch, which makes decisions on how laws are interpreted. So it consists of the Supreme Court, a group of 9 justices who make decisions about whether laws are fair and how they should be applied. The judicial branch also includes federal judges throughout the country. Unlike the legislative and executive branches, most justices of the judicial branch serve for life. I mean, they don't have a set amount of term, they serve for the remainder of their life. Each federal justice is selected by the president and must be approved by the Senate. So let's go and take a look at the stop and check. It says, think. Why did the founders want the government's powers and duties separated? So remember they said they want the government's powers and duties separated so that no one branch of government has too much power. Okay, they wanted to be able to check and balance everything so that no one branch has too much power.